There's something about dynasties that captures our imagination. We watch them rise, we admire their power, and somewhere deep down, we wonder what it costs. The Maxwell family seemed to have it all: wealth beyond measure, influence that reached into the highest corridors of power, a publishing empire that shaped public opinion across continents. But beneath the gilded surface, something was festering. What looked like success from the outside was actually a house of cards, and when it fell, it didn't just collapse. It shattered, taking with it the lives of everyone connected to it. This is the story of how a family climbed to the very top, only to discover that the man who built their empire had been stealing from the very people who trusted him most. It's about children who grew up in the shadow of a giant, never knowing whether they were loved or merely useful. And it's about how one daughter's choices would eventually make the Maxwell name synonymous not with power, but with something far darker. From Jan Hoch to Robert Maxwell. The man who started it all wasn't born Robert Maxwell. He was born Jan Ludwig Hyman Benjamin Hoch in 1923, in a small town in what was then Czechoslovakia, a place that would eventually be swallowed by history, shifting from one country to another depending on which army happened to be marching through. He grew up speaking Yiddish in an Orthodox Jewish family so poor that survival itself was an accomplishment. He had 6 siblings, and most of them, along with most of his extended family, would never make it out of Auschwitz. But Jan did. He escaped to France, joined the Czechoslovak army in exile, and eventually found his way into the British forces. By the time the war ended, he'd earned the Military Cross for bravery and had reinvented himself entirely. He became Ian Robert Maxwell, and later just Robert Maxwell, a name that would eventually be whispered in boardrooms and shouted in Parliament. The transformation was complete when he married Elizabeth Maynard in 1945, a French Protestant woman who represented everything his childhood wasn't: educated, connected, from a world where people owned silk factories and had ancestors who'd been kings. Together, they would have 9 children over the next 16 years. Elizabeth would later say they were trying to recreate the family that had been murdered in the Holocaust, to fill the void left by all those lost relatives. But you can't replace people like they're missing pieces in a puzzle. What they created instead was something else entirely, something that would carry the weight of that impossible goal for decades. The first cracks appeared early, though it would take years before anyone understood what they meant. A family built on loss. In 1957, their daughter Karine died of leukemia at just 3 years old. It was devastating, the kind of loss that breaks families. But there was no time to break. Maxwell was building an empire, acquiring Pergamon Press and transforming it into a major academic publisher. Money was flowing, power was accumulating, and grief was something you compartmentalized and pushed down deep where it couldn't slow you down. Then came December 25th, 1961. Just 48 hours after Elizabeth gave birth to their 9th child, a daughter named Ghislaine, their eldest son Michael was being driven home. He was 15 years old, full of promise and potential. The driver fell asleep at the wheel and crashed headlong into another vehicle. Michael was severely injured, and he never regained consciousness. For 7 years, he remained in a coma while the family went about their lives, visiting a son and brother who would never wake up, never speak again, never open his eyes. He died in 1968, having spent nearly half of his brief life suspended between this world and the next. Imagine growing up in that house. Your father is this larger-than-life figure who's buying newspapers and flying helicopters and sailing yachts, appearing on television and making deals that move markets. While upstairs or in some hospital room, your older brother is lying motionless, breathing but not living. Elizabeth later said that Ghislaine, the baby born just before Michael's accident, showed signs of anorexia as a young child. At 3 years old, Ghislaine was finally forced to declare to her mother, "Mummy, I exist." Think about that for a moment. A toddler having to announce her own existence because the grief and chaos were so consuming that she'd become invisible in her own home. Robert Maxwell dealt with loss by becoming more, by expanding, by dominating every space he entered. He moved the family into Headington Hill Hall in Oxford, a sprawling mansion he rented from the city council for £2,400 a year. He called it the best council house in the country, which was his idea of a joke. But it wasn't really a home, it was headquarters. The helicopter that shuttled him around Oxford became a familiar sound overhead, a symbol of his success and his refusal to be bound by ordinary constraints like traffic or time. The yacht, eventually named Lady Ghislaine after his youngest daughter, became a floating office where business was conducted and power was displayed. His children weren't just his children. They were assets, extensions of the empire he was building. 5 of them, Christine, Isabel, Ian, Kevin, and Ghislaine, would eventually work in his companies. They didn't really have a choice. Working for their father wasn't presented as an option, but as an expectation, a duty, the price you paid for being a Maxwell. Philip, the brilliant scientist who won a scholarship to Balliol College at 16, tried to escape. He married an Argentinian woman named Nilda, moved away, tried to build his own life separate from the family business and the overwhelming presence of his father. Robert never forgave him for it. Philip was mocked, ridiculed in front of visitors, written off as a disappointment. Years later, he would end up separated from his wife, reportedly living in a bedsit in North London, another casualty of trying to be his own person in a family where loyalty meant submission and independence was treated as betrayal. But even those who stayed, who submitted to their father's will and worked in his companies, weren't safe from his cruelty. The empire's fatal cracks. Ian was taunted mercilessly growing up, ridiculed by Robert in front of visiting friends, compared unfavorably to his younger brother Kevin. The humiliation was constant, deliberate, a way of keeping him uncertain and dependent. But he stayed. Kevin, meanwhile, was the clever one, the driving force behind many of the business operations. He admitted to being completely in awe of his father, missing his presence and ability to dominate. These weren't healthy relationships built on love and mutual respect. They were dependencies, the kind that would make what came next even more tragic. Throughout the 1980s, Maxwell's empire expanded aggressively. He bought the British Printing Corporation, then Mirror Group newspapers, giving him control over the Daily Mirror and other major publications. Then he acquired Macmillan Publishers in New York, expanding his reach into American markets. He was in a constant battle with Rupert Murdoch, another media titan, and Maxwell desperately wanted not just to beat Murdoch, but to earn his respect, to be seen as an equal. He succeeded in neither. Murdoch would later call Maxwell nothing more than a crook and a total buffoon. That assessment, as it turned out, wasn't entirely wrong. What nobody knew, or what people suspected but couldn't prove, was that Maxwell was drowning in debt. The aggressive expansion had left him massively overextended. When the economic bubble of the 1980s burst and interest rates jumped, Maxwell did what desperate men often do. He started moving money around, shuffling funds between accounts, using loans from one company to shore up another. And then he did something worse, something that would eventually destroy whatever remained of his reputation. He started raiding the pension funds of his own employees. Think about what that means for a moment. These were people who'd worked for Maxwell's companies for years, sometimes decades. people who'd contributed part of every paycheck to their retirement funds, trusting that the money would be there when they needed it, when they were too old to work anymore. Maxwell was taking that money, hundreds of millions of pounds, and using it to keep his failing empire afloat. He was stealing from the people who'd built his fortune, betraying the most fundamental trust between an employer and the people who work for him. But in late 1991, the walls were closing in. The death that changed everything. Maxwell was supposed to attend a meeting at the Bank of England. He'd been summoned because he'd defaulted on £50 million in debt, and questions were being asked. Uncomfortable questions about where the money had gone and how he was going to pay it back. Instead of going to that meeting, he took his yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, and sailed to the Canary Islands. According to reports, he had a heated argument with his son Kevin the day before he left. Kevin wanted to leave the family business. The strain was becoming unbearable, the pressure of trying to hold together something that was clearly falling apart. On November 5th, 1991, at 4:25 in the morning, Maxwell made his last contact with the crew of the Lady Ghislaine. Half an hour earlier, he'd called to complain that he was too hot, demanding they turn off the air conditioning in his cabin. At 4:25, he called again, now complaining he was too cold. He ordered them to turn the air conditioning back off. These were the last words anyone heard him speak, this mundane complaint about temperature, this ordinary moment that would become the final detail of an extraordinary life. Later that morning, when the crew went to check on him, they discovered he was missing. His body was found floating in the Atlantic Ocean, naked except for a graze on his left shoulder. The official ruling was death by heart attack combined with accidental drowning, though 3 different pathologists couldn't agree on the exact cause of death. Some speculated he'd been urinating off the side of the yacht, which he apparently often did. Others wondered if he'd jumped, unable to face the financial disaster he knew was coming, choosing the ocean over the courtroom. And some, including his own family members, believed he'd been murdered, that someone had decided to solve a problem by ending his life. His daughter Ghislaine would later say she was certain he didn't take his own life, that someone must have ended it for him. The speculation about his death continues to this day, but what happened next is beyond dispute. The sons on trial within weeks. Investigators discovered the missing £440 million from the pension funds. Robert Maxwell, the war hero, the Member of Parliament, the media mogul who dined with presidents and prime ministers, had been the biggest thief in British criminal history. His reputation transformed overnight from business genius to fraudster, and his family was left to deal with the fallout. Kevin and Ian Maxwell, who'd been running the day-to-day operations of the business empire, suddenly found themselves at the center of a massive fraud investigation. In June 1992, Kevin was arrested and charged with fraud. The charges were clear and devastating. He and Ian had allegedly misused pension fund assets to raise loans to save the debt-ridden private Maxwell companies. Kevin alone faced charges involving £122 million. In October 1992, Kevin was declared bankrupt with debts of £400 million, which remains the biggest personal bankruptcy in UK history to this day. For 4 years, the brothers lived under this cloud. The trial began in 1995, a mammoth 130-day proceeding that cost taxpayers £12 million. The prosecution laid out the case methodically, day after day, detailing the movement of money, the questionable loans, the pension fund transfers. The defense argued that the brothers had trusted their father, that they'd been kept in the dark about the full extent of the fraud, that Robert Maxwell had operated in secrecy even from his own sons. Kevin testified about his father, explaining that Robert Maxwell did not consider himself above the law, but would stretch it as far as it would go. In January 1996, the jury acquitted them. All charges dropped, but the damage was done. Kevin would later become the only Maxwell sibling to publicly express remorse, speaking about the moral burden he would carry for the rest of his life. His wife, Pandora, told the court that Kevin's relationship with his father had been strained in the months before Robert's death, and that he desperately wanted to leave the family business. Now he was free in a legal sense, but the Maxwell name was ruined. Business opportunities dried up, limited mostly to overseas ventures where the name wasn't so notorious. The pension fund employees weren't as fortunate. While there was eventually a government rescue effort, and investment banks like Lehman Brothers, Goldman Sachs, and Coopers and Lybrand helped replenish some of the stolen money, it wasn't enough. In general, pensioners received about half of what they were entitled to. Half. People who'd worked their entire lives, who'd planned their retirements around the promise of financial security, now faced old age with half the money they'd counted on. Some had to go back to work. Some had to sell their homes. Some never recovered financially. Elizabeth Maxwell, who'd stood by her husband through everything, who'd raised 9 children and supported his ambitions for decades, was left with nothing. She lost her pension, her property, everything. Her children supported her financially, and eventually the Duke of Westminster let her rent a townhouse at a minimal cost. She would later say that the worst years of her life were from 1981 to 1991, the final decade of her marriage. She'd been at Robert's beck and call with no recognition. Nothing was right. Nothing was good enough. What saved her, she said, was her work on the Holocaust, the research that gave her life meaning beyond being Robert Maxwell's wife. But the tragedy of the Maxwell family was far from over. The favourite daughter's dark secret. While Kevin and Ian tried to rebuild their lives, eventually launching a think tank in 2018 focused on combating terrorism, and while Christine and Isabel found success in Silicon Valley's tech boom, it was Ghislaine who would bring the Maxwell name back into the headlines in the most disturbing way possible. Ghislaine had always been special. She was Robert's favourite, born on Christmas Day, the baby of the family who arrived just before Michael's accident. When Michael lay in his coma and the family grieved, it was Ghislaine who seemed to bring light back into Robert's life. He indulged her, spoiled her, marked her out as different from the others. The yacht was named after her, an honour none of the other children received. After Robert's death in 1991, she moved to New York City and became a fixture in Manhattan's social scene. She was connected, charming, and sophisticated. She dated, moved in elite circles, and seemed to be building a separate life from the family scandal. That's how she met Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein was a wealthy financier with homes in New York, New Mexico, Palm Beach, and a private island in the US Virgin Islands. He had connections to politicians, princes, and scientists. He presented himself as a philanthropist, donating to universities and research. According to later court testimony, he engaged in serious criminal activity, and Ghislaine Maxwell was involved in his operations. Court documents revealed that Maxwell would approach young girls from difficult backgrounds. She would befriend them, take them shopping and to social events, and position herself as a mentor. She presented opportunities and guidance. However, this was part of a larger scheme connected to Epstein's criminal enterprise. Virginia Roberts Giuffre provided testimony during the trial. She stated that Maxwell was involved in the case against Epstein. Giuffre explained the connection between Maxwell and Epstein. Court records showed multiple young people reported similar stories. Maxwell connected individuals to Epstein. This happened repeatedly over time. Maxwell was part of the legal case brought by federal prosecutors. She was present during the time period in question, She had knowledge of events. The legal proceedings revealed she took actions that aided Epstein. Some individuals involved were as young as 14. The pattern lasted for several years. Their conduct remained secret because of their financial resources and social position. Those in their circle did not know what occurred. Justice finally arrives. But in 2019, Epstein was finally arrested on federal charges. He was held in a New York jail, and in August of that year, he was found unresponsive in his cell. The official ruling was that he had taken his own life, though conspiracy theories immediately emerged suggesting otherwise. Either way, Epstein was gone, but Maxwell remained. In July 2020, the FBI arrested Ghislaine Maxwell in New Hampshire, where she'd been hiding in a property she'd purchased through a carefully structured company to keep her name off the records. She was charged with multiple crimes related to the enticement and trafficking of minors. She was denied bail, with the judge noting concerns about her completely opaque finances, her skill at living in hiding, and the fact that France, where she held citizenship, doesn't extradite its citizens. The trial was set for December 2021. Throughout the trial, her siblings stood by her. Isabel attended every day, sitting in the public gallery, waving gestures of support to her sister. Kevin was there for several days, speaking to reporters about the conditions she was enduring, arguing she was being inadequately fed and mistreated. Ian and Christine also appeared. They launched a website proclaiming their belief in her innocence, insisting that she was being scapegoated for Epstein's crimes. It was a strange echo of their defense of their father all those years ago, a family closing ranks even when the evidence suggested they shouldn't, even when loyalty might be misplaced. The prosecution presented testimony from victims, now women, who described what Maxwell had done to them when they were girls. They described the grooming, the manipulation, the way she'd made them trust her before betraying that trust in the worst possible way. They described their trauma, the years of therapy, the difficulty forming relationships, the way those experiences had shaped and damaged their lives. The defense argued that Maxwell was being blamed for Epstein's crimes, that she was a victim herself, manipulated by a powerful man. The jury didn't buy it. In December 2021, after a month-long trial, Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted on 5 out of 6 counts, including trafficking a minor. The verdict was read in a courtroom packed with victims and their supporters, with journalists and members of the public who'd followed the case. When the guilty verdicts were announced, some victims cried. Others sat in silence, processing what this moment meant after years of waiting for justice. In June 2022, Ghislaine Maxwell was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, the legacy of a fallen dynasty. The U.S. attorney called it a sentence that held her accountable for perpetrating heinous crimes against children, noting that no one is above the law and that it's never too late for justice. For the victims who testified, women now who'd been girls when Maxwell groomed them, it was a measure of closure. But closure doesn't undo trauma, doesn't give back the years stolen or the innocence taken. It doesn't erase the nightmares or fix the broken trust or heal the wounds that never quite close. And so, the Maxwell dynasty ended, not with a simple fall, but with a catastrophic implosion that spanned generations and continents. It started with a man who survived the Holocaust and reinvented himself, who built an empire but could never stop needing more, who stole from his own employees to maintain an illusion of success. It continued with children who grew up in luxury but paid for it with their emotional well-being, who either submitted to their father's will or were exiled from the family. And it ended with a daughter who had every advantage, every opportunity, who could have done anything with her life, but chose instead to help a predator harm children. There are patterns here that feel almost Shakespearean in their tragedy. The patriarch who demands total loyalty and crushes anyone who seeks independence. The children who know something is wrong, but can't escape the gravity of the family name. The money that seems limitless, but is actually built on theft. The yacht named for a favorite daughter who would one day sit in a federal prison. The Holocaust survivor whose own moral compass was so broken that he could justify stealing from working people. The war hero whose courage on the battlefield didn't translate into decency in business or kindness in family life. But unlike Shakespeare, these aren't characters in a play, they're real people. The Mirror Group employees who lost their pensions were real, facing real financial hardship in their retirement years. The young girls whom Ghislaine Maxwell groomed and delivered to Epstein were real, carrying real trauma into their adult lives. The family members who lived through Michael's coma and Karene's death, and Robert's drowning, and the pension scandal, and Ghislaine's conviction, they're real too, living with a legacy that's been poisoned beyond repair. Kevin Maxwell once said that his father would stretch the law as far as it would go. That turned out to be an understatement. Robert Maxwell didn't just bend rules, he broke them catastrophically, stealing hundreds of millions and leaving ordinary people to pay the price. And his daughter didn't just stretch moral boundaries, she crossed them in ways that destroyed young lives. The question that haunts the Maxwell story is whether these outcomes were inevitable, whether something in the family's DNA made this trajectory unavoidable, or whether different choices at key moments could have changed everything. The Maxwell story reminds us that dynasties aren't just about wealth and power. They're about what gets passed down through generations, the lessons absorbed at the dinner table, the patterns repeated without examination. Robert Maxwell taught his children that what mattered was winning, dominating, never showing weakness. He taught them that other people were either useful or irrelevant. He taught them that family loyalty meant protecting the name above everything else, even truth, even justice. Some of his children rejected those lessons and paid for it with exile and mockery. Others internalized them and paid a different price, one measured in court verdicts and prison sentences. Today, the Maxwell name carries weight, but not the kind Robert would have wanted. It's not associated with media empires or political influence or business acumen. It's associated with pension fraud and trafficking, with lives ruined and trust betrayed on a massive scale. Headington Hill Hall, where the family once lived in splendor, entertaining politicians and celebrities, went to the receivers after Robert's death. The mansion that had hosted grand parties and important meetings, where deals were struck and power was displayed, stood empty for a time before being repurposed. Elizabeth eventually sold everything that remained and returned to France, where she lived until her death in 2013, spending her final years far from the wreckage of the life she'd built with Robert. The yacht was sold, renamed, stripped of the Maxwell identity. The empire collapsed piece by piece. The money disappeared into the hands of creditors and lawyers. The power evaporated like morning fog burned away by the rising sun. What remains is a cautionary tale about ambition without ethics, about family loyalty taken to a toxic extreme, about how the drive to build something great can become the justification for doing terrible things. The Maxwell children who survived and stayed out of prison are still trying to live their lives, some quietly, some still defending the family name with a determination that seems almost desperate. Christine and Isabel carved out careers in technology, working in Silicon Valley during its boom years, building something separate from the family legacy. But the name they're defending isn't the one Robert built through decades of business deals and media acquisitions. It's the one he destroyed through theft and deception. They're trying to reclaim something that might have never really existed, a version of their father and their family that was noble and worthy. that deserved the respect it once commanded. In the end, the Maxwell dynasty fell apart, not because of external enemies or bad luck or changing times. It fell apart because of choices, deliberate decisions to value power over people, success over integrity, the family image over the truth. Robert Maxwell chose to steal from his employees rather than admit failure and downsize his empire. He could have scaled back, could have sold off parts of the business, could have faced his creditors honestly. But that would have meant admitting weakness, showing vulnerability, accepting that he wasn't invincible. So instead, he reached into the pension funds, taking money that wasn't his, betraying people who'd given him years of their working lives. Ghislaine Maxwell chose to help Jeffrey Epstein harm children, rather than walk away from that relationship and build a different life. She had options, had resources, had the education and connections to do anything she wanted. But she chose complicity, chose to participate in exploitation, chose her own comfort over the safety of vulnerable young girls. These weren't mistakes or accidents or momentary lapses in judgment. They were choices, sustained patterns of behavior repeated over years, and choices have consequences that echo long after the moment passes. The consequences rippled outward like waves from a stone thrown into still water, touching everyone connected to the family in ways both visible and hidden. Pensioners who'd trusted their employer faced retirement with half their expected income, forced to make impossible choices between medication and food, between heating their homes and paying their bills. Some returned to work in their 70s, bodies worn out, but bank accounts empty. Young women carried trauma from their teenage years into adulthood, into their own relationships and families, struggling to trust, struggling to feel safe, struggling to believe they deserved better than what had been done to them. Family members lived with the knowledge of what their father and sister had done, trying to reconcile the people they'd known, the moments of tenderness or humor or connection, with the crimes they'd committed. Every family dinner, every birthday, every memory was now tainted, viewed through the lens of what came after. And the Maxwell name, which Robert had worked so hard to establish and elevate, which he'd built from nothing through ambition and will and ruthless determination, became a synonym for scandal and corruption, spoken with disgust instead of respect. There's no redemption arc here, no moment where someone steps forward to make things right, to undo the damage or compensate the victims. Kevin's expression of moral burden is the closest thing to an apology the victims ever received from the Maxwell family, and even that came wrapped in legal language and careful phrasing, acknowledging pain without fully accepting responsibility. The pension funds were partially, but not fully, replenished through government intervention and legal settlements, a bureaucratic solution that couldn't fully heal the financial wounds or restore what had been stolen. Ghislaine's victims testified and saw her convicted, watched her led away in handcuffs, heard the judge pronounce a sentence of 20 years. But that doesn't undo what happened to them, doesn't erase the years of trauma, or give them back their innocence or their teenage years. It doesn't fix the relationships that fell apart because they couldn't trust anyone. It doesn't quiet the nightmares that still wake them decades later. The dynasty that Robert Maxwell built didn't just collapse, it poisoned the ground where it stood, making it impossible for anything healthy to grow there again, contaminating everything it touched with the corruption at its core. What the Maxwell story ultimately shows us is how much damage one family can do when power becomes the only value that matters, when winning becomes more important than how you win, when maintaining the image becomes more important than being worthy of that image. Robert Maxwell escaped the Holocaust, served his country with bravery, and built a significant publishing empire. Those are real achievements that shouldn't be dismissed or erased from history. But they weren't enough for him. He needed more, always more. And when he couldn't get it legitimately through business deals and market competition, he stole it from people who'd trusted him, from employees who'd believed their futures were secure. The war hero who'd risked his life for freedom became the thief who stole security from working people. The self-made man who'd built an empire from nothing couldn't accept the possibility of losing it, so he destroyed it himself rather than let it shrink naturally. Ghislaine Maxwell grew up with every advantage imaginable, educated at Oxford, connected to the wealthy and powerful around the world, free to build whatever life she wanted. She spoke multiple languages, moved in elite circles, had opportunities most people never dream of. But she chose to use those advantages to help exploit vulnerable children. That choice, repeated over years, destroying one young life after another, destroyed lives and eventually destroyed her own freedom. The advantages didn't corrupt her. The choices did. Decisions made again and again to prioritize her own comfort and status over the well-being of young girls who should have been protected. She could have walked away at any time, could have called the police, could have used her connections to help instead of harm. But she didn't. And that's what makes her crimes so incomprehensible to many people. She had no excuse, no desperate circumstances, no lack of options. She simply chose cruelty and exploitation. The saddest part might be the children who didn't choose this path, who were just born into a family that would become infamous. Philip, who tried to escape and paid for it with ridicule and estrangement, who wanted nothing more than to be a scientist and live his own life away from the empire. Anne, who pursued acting and then disappeared from public life, avoiding the spotlight that destroyed so many others, choosing obscurity over the constant glare of judgment. Michael and Karine, who died young and never had to see what their family would become, never had to carry the weight of that legacy or answer questions about their father's crimes or their sister's conviction. In some ways, their early deaths were mercies, though that's a terrible thing to think about any child. Even Ian and Kevin, who were acquitted but spent years under suspicion, their names forever linked to their father's crimes, even though they were cleared of wrongdoing. They testified, they defended themselves, they were found innocent, but the stain never fully washed away. They all carried the weight of the Maxwell name, whether they wanted to or not, whether they deserved to or not, whether they'd done anything wrong themselves, or simply had the misfortune of being born into the wrong family. Dynasties rise on ambition and fall on corruption, but they also fall on something simpler, the belief that the rules don't apply to you, that your family name puts you above ordinary morality, that loyalty to family trumps loyalty to truth and justice. The Maxwells believed all of that, and it destroyed them from the inside out. What looked like an empire was actually a fraud built on stolen money, a house of cards that could only stand as long as no one looked too closely at the foundation. What looked like a family was actually a collection of people trapped in roles they couldn't escape, damaged by a patriarch who saw them as extensions of himself rather than as individuals with their own needs and dreams. And what looked like success was actually a slow-motion catastrophe that took decades to fully reveal itself, peeling back layer after layer to expose the rot underneath the polish. The Maxwell story is over now, at least in terms of new chapters being written. Robert is dead, found floating in the Atlantic under mysterious circumstances that will never be fully explained. Elizabeth is gone, having lived her final years trying to rebuild some kind of dignity separate from her husband's crimes, reconnecting with her work on the Holocaust, the one thing that gave her life meaning beyond being Mrs. Robert Maxwell. Ghislaine is in prison, facing decades behind bars for her role in harming children. her name now synonymous with the worst kind of betrayal. The other siblings are scattered across the globe, some trying to rebuild careers in technology and business, others living quietly away from public scrutiny, all carrying a name that means something very different now than it did when their father first built his empire. The helicopters are gone. The yachts are sold. The mansion is repurposed. The newspapers belong to other owners. What we're left with is a story that seems almost too dark to be true, too tragic to have happened to one family. But it did happen. It is true. And the victims are still living with the consequences every single day. The employees who lost their pensions are still dealing with the financial impact decades later, living in smaller homes than they'd planned, cutting back on medications, unable to help their grandchildren with college the way they'd hoped. The women who were groomed and abused as teenagers are still processing the trauma, still in therapy, still working to build healthy relationships and trust other people. The Maxwell children who weren't involved in the crimes are still living under the shadow of a name they can never fully escape, introducing themselves and watching people's faces change when they make the connection, seeing the questions form even when they're not spoken aloud. This is what happens when a family's story becomes defined by the worst things its members have done. When the name that was supposed to represent achievement and success instead represents betrayal and harm. The Maxwell dynasty didn't just end, it imploded, taking decades to fully collapse and leaving destruction in its wake. And now, when people hear that name, they don't think of publishing empires or political connections or business acumen. They think of pension fraud and trafficking, of lives destroyed and trust betrayed. That's the Maxwell legacy now, and no amount of rehabilitation or rewriting can change it. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.